GeogAtoZ, supporting the National Festival of Fieldwork from the Geographical Association. Today is L for land use, and perhaps the key question here is for us when we're going out to prepare for fieldwork with young children, how can we tell a story about what the land is used for near our school? Now, of course, you may have all done colouring in of high streets in terms of different types of shops. You may have done those sorts of surveys, but we want to think about the physical geography of our land use as well. What are the parks? What are the green spaces? What are the blue spaces like as well? So, how can we use the tools that we can find online, and how can we use generative AI to help us as well? Well, my thinking is very much sparked by a article that I read a number of years ago by Mark Easton, which had a really useful calculator on the BBC News website, which told us how much of our area was built on. And I remember looking at this in terms of London and really amazing some children once, where we were telling them about their London Borough of Ealing, and that had just 1% of farmland. So the rest of the 99% was the other sorts of use. So I really found that was very useful. Sadly, it doesn't work anymore. So that led me to some other thoughts on how we could use the different tools you can find online to gather this sort of data and have this data as teachers in mind when we're doing this sort of planning, not necessarily to show all these images to children, but to give us that base of subject knowledge, to give us that context within which to teach a sense of place within our particular locality. So there's the kind of macro view, the view of the UK, which is quite useful to consider, which is there on the images. And if you've ever used Dan Raven Ellison's UK in 100 seconds videos that you can find on YouTube freely available, those are really useful to give that kind of macro global perspective of the UK. But actually, we want to zoom in. We're doing field work, we're doing this locally on our streets. What do our local streets look like? So using generative AI, because that was the best tool I could find, and kind of sense checking this myself because this is my locality, sense checking this against other areas as well, I think this is reasonably useful, certainly for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 teachers and maybe the children that we're working with as well. So we're using the idea of 100% in the area that I'm in at the moment. This has about half homes and flats. 30% we're quite blessed in terms of the green space, the parks and the commons that we have. Roads and streets themselves, really useful to study, as the last few videos have considered, are about 10% of the whole locality. Shops and offices make up another 5%, and factories and warehouses, again, sense checking that seems about right, 3% in this locality. And then finally, other buildings and schools make up about 2%. So then looking at this in terms of a comparison between the next door locality, the next postcode area, that's the kind of boundary that I've picked here of SW17. You can see two Google Maps there comparing those two particular localities. And again, a very similar set of numbers there to compare these two comparator boroughs. And you could do this yourself just by typing into ChatGPT or another AI to try and give you that sense of out of 100 bits of land, as it describes it, these are the stats that it came up with. But as I said, it's useful to think about a comparator with another area to kind of sense check this. So I picked central London because that's quite an interesting comparator to start off with. So I picked the SW1 postcode, and you can see there fewer homes and flats straight away off the bat. Parks and green spaces, interestingly, in the centre of London, it's an increased amount, 32% there. And again, there's some categories to look into in terms of how that's been calculated. No farms and fields, interestingly to see these pop up. No appreciable lakes and water, even though, of course, we've got rivers and streams and culverts and canals in some of these places, but actually out of 100%, that's less than 1%. Roads and streets, interesting. Perhaps you'd agree with this. Central London has a greater percentage. Shops and offices, double the amount. Again, kind of makes sense. Factories and industrial, again, a very small amount in central London, and schools and other buildings. When you include palaces and things like that, grand government buildings like that, again, that sense checking that kind of makes general sense for Key Stage 2 children. But let's go beyond. Let's go to Ambleside in the Lake District and let's do a comparator there. A very different shape of borough, clearly in terms of the landscape formed compared to the rather than the rivers or the roads, the rail links. This is about sides of mountains. This is about valleys. This is about a very different way of carving up the land in terms of a particular postcode. So clearly, a lot of homes clustered around the roads, a lot of public buildings around the main thoroughfares there and around the lake. But then in some of the more rural spots of this particular postcode, there'll be very few people and there'll be other things going on. So let's have a look at what this looks like there. So again, the same stats. So 5% homes, 20% parks and green spaces. So interesting thing to think about. There's more spaces for people that are classified as parks and set aside green spaces in central London than there are in a rural location, tourist hotspot, admittedly, of Ambleside. But of course, that doesn't account for the other green spaces that we've got for farms and fields, which is 60% of this Ambleside postcode. And then you've got 10% lakes and water, which again, sense checking that kind of makes sense there in terms of the water capture area there, and the lakes and the streams and so on, the tarns and so on. Roads and streets, again, makes sense, 3%. Shops and offices, fewer, but certainly clustered together. It can look quite urbanized in places for sure if you know that part of the world. Factories, nothing to speak of though, and schools. There are schools there, but again, less than 1% of the total landmass. So you can imagine how if you're doing comparator field work, virtual field work, if you are preparing a land use case study for somewhere else in the UK, this could be quite useful to do. But again, have that sense in mind of, does this actually represent what the map says? You need to compare it against another source to see if this kind of makes sense. And you can imagine doing some shading with children to kind of see if this does match the real world. Moving on then, there are other tools that you might want to bear in mind. And again, I've done some searching around. I'd love some feedback if you've got any other ones yourselves. Clearly, you can subscribe to things like Digimap for schools, a really great resource, and you can get some of this stuff. But I'm trying to focus on free resources here. ArcGIS has different ways that you can use the different tools to display maps, and you can see one for my locality, where you can see public buildings, homes, gardens, and things laid out there according to ESA mapping that you can find. And what's quite useful with this, if you go into some of the other tools that you can find that are allied to this, and this is an EU site, you can start to pick out other different sorts of wider categories, which perhaps for Key Stage 2 children is useful. So it doesn't just categorize it as green space or open space. You can actually think about crops that may be in some parts of Europe if you were studying a distant place, snow and ice, wetlands, and so on. So there's a real depth there that you might want to look into. Again, in a hyper-local case study you were looking at, but again, I'm thinking about the comparator between your fieldwork that you're doing locally and somewhere else that you might want to look at as well. So you can get to that via that QR code. But if we're looking at London again, you can see there the Thames and the bridges and the green space of different sorts there. Some really interesting maps that provoke questions. And that's what this is all about, really. Not flooding them with numbers, flooding them with vocabulary, but just saying, say what you see. What are we looking at here? Can you talk about the different features of a color coded map like this? And you can zoom in, and what's quite powerful is when you've got it on a screen, or maybe if you've printed them out separately, you can then compare and contrast between that and the map itself. You can kind of go between where there are clearly roads and rail links that are not very visible there, and then compare that to the specific locational knowledge, the named locations that you can see on the map there. So it is worth thinking about your locality and how you could find this sort of information out yourself. And then you can annotate it, certainly using the snipping tool. I've annotated there the River Wandle and some of the many different channels that have been created over time for various industrial purposes and to support flood defences and the Environment Agency weirs and all those sorts of things that help to channel that water that travels 12 miles from the surrounding South London higher land down to the Thames where it flows at Wandsworth. So lots of kind of things that you can consider. What's included, what's excluded, what's visible, what's invisible, what are we focusing on today when we're doing our specific local studies, maybe in that park that you can see on the image down. There's many other ways you can display this to help, again, focus on the place knowledge, focus on the locational knowledge, and help to provoke those questions with the children that you're working with. But perhaps the biggest find in my trawl to try and think about how we could build up your sense of place with children, link that kind of global macro perspective to the hyperlocal perspectives, is this regional perspective that comes through from the Land Cover Atlas of the United Kingdom from the University of Sheffield, produced by Alistair Ray. And this produces these really powerful maps that I really pored over, where you can compare different regions, different parts of the UK. So that's Herefordshire. Just give you a moment to stare at that and wonder at that, and the locations that are picked out there, and the different types of forest, for example, you can see there on the left-hand side: coniferous forest, mixed forest, pasture land, which is a really major component part of the UK land cover that we have. Not without controversy, as you'll see on the very final slides of this video. But then you can compare it to somewhere else that may be more like where you teach, in the Stoke-on-Trent area, where you can see you've got these phrases that you wouldn't use with young children in Key Stage 1 or 2, but it's just urban. It's just urban areas. This is urban fabric, as it's described here. And in the outskirts, though, you have got pasture land as well, which is grazing land, or is urban parkland, I suspect, in this case. But you can imagine doing a very local study, knowing this area yourself, doing field work yourself, and trying to compare and contrast different locations. And there's all sorts of government stats that you can find online as well, if you were comparing maybe your region to another region as well, which you can see on the example there, which focuses on developed land, non-developed land, and vacant land as well. We don't really have anything to speak of in terms of vacant land in the UK, but it's this idea of areas being undeveloped or non-developed, and the particular category of that you might want to focus on, because clearly London is highly developed, but then still has a lot of green space, as we've talked about as well, at a kind of regional uh, link, as well as a local link as well. But finally, the one great resource that I pick out to bring all this together, really, to bring that sense of human and physical, nature and human spaces together. George Monbiot's written an article just this week on the huge areas of Britain which he's calling biodiverse deserts, because they're dominated by a singular species. And this may be very resonant to you, certainly is resonant to me in some of the regions that I've walked over in the UK. And actually, these are not very good places to see wildlife, to think of as biodiverse locations. And he's calling them dead zones. And these are actually spreading given the climate challenges that we've got. But actually, on the other side, if we're going to stop being quite so negative about the nature depletion in the UK, we've got some examples here of these green spaces in London. As I've said, 20 to 30% in some areas. There are some species which are thriving: clearly squirrels, parakeets, foxes, rats, all those sorts of things in London and the surrounding areas. But you will find owl sightings increasing. So it's this whole winners or losers thing, and it's not a binary of one thing or the other. But there are other stories we can tell. We need to be careful with young children about the stories that we tell, but we do need to provoke that sense of awe and wonder, even if we do sometimes need to focus on, actually, is that landscape in the bottom left a natural landscape? Is that a landscape that we wish? Is that a landscape that's always been there? Is that a landscape that could be treated in a different way if we planted other things there, or let them rewild, as the phrase goes? So I hope that was useful. Tomorrow we're going to focus on M for measure. Do support the National Festival of Fieldwork wherever you can.